the PLA, the Chinese military, wants to fight a joint warfare where all the services work together. But they've been working out, what does that mean? What is their joint doctrine? What's their joint organization? They've made a lot of progress with that, but they're now at the point of having to rewrite the war plans. How is this going to work in detail? How is the Army going to work with the Air Force, going to work with the Navy in really synergistic ways where everybody knows what to do? And then once you know what you want to do, you then have to train together to figure out how to execute that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about this weekend's crucial election in Taiwan, which could have massive geopolitical implications around the world. Joining me is Dr. Philip Saunders, the director of the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs and a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University's Institute for National Strategic Studies. Philip has also edited or co-edited 9 books on Asian security, including Crossing the Strait, China's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan. Dr. Saunders, welcome to Frontline.
Happy to be here.
First of all, to many in the West, Taiwan is just a faraway island of which we know little. So why does this election matter so much?
It matters in the near term for Taiwan's future, who is going to lead it for the next 4 years. But why we're really concerned is it's a big factor with respect to relations with China. China views Taiwan as part of its territory, but it doesn't control it. And the question is, who will be the leader in Taiwan? How will they posture themselves vis-a-vis China? Is that going to lead to further instability and possibly a conflict, or is it going to lead to more stability and dialogue across the strait? That's one of the things that's at stake this weekend. And that matters. It matters for China and Taiwan, obviously. It matters for all of Asia. It matters for the United States. And I'd argue it matters for Europe as well.
And I know much of our audience here on Frontline will be fully aware of the long history between China and Taiwan. But for those who aren't, can you give us a brief backstory?
Sure. Well, the origins of this go back to the end of the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Communist Party won in 1949. They founded the People's Republic of China. And all of the old Republic of China government went across the strait, sailed across the strait, and reestablished themselves on the island of Taiwan. The PRC probably would have successfully invaded it then, but we had the Korean War. The U.S. 7th Fleet got in the way. The U.S. had a military alliance with Taiwan, and so PRC efforts to take Taiwan by force were thwarted at that point. In 1979, the U.S. normalized relations with China. We ended the alliance with Taiwan, and there's been this uneasy circumstance across the strait where de facto it's been independent, but China continues to claim it as part of China and reserve the right to use force. But at that time, they were focused on modernization and they emphasized peaceful unification. So that's been kind of the backdrop. What's changed on the Taiwan side has been democracy. That when the Republic of China government established itself there, it basically was an authoritarian dictatorship for the better part of 30 years. But it gradually started pursuing democracy and free elections. And the result of that is that the Taiwan political systems become more responsive to the people who live there. And the people who live there are not so eager to have unification with China, on any terms, and certainly not with the current government. So that's the situation we're in, where Taiwan's de facto independent, less and less interested in unification. China's more and more powerful, committed to unification, and starting to use its power, economic power, military power, to pressure Taiwan to start some kind of political talks about unification.
So you would say that the tensions we're seeing now are more to do with changes within Taiwan than changes within China?
I think ultimately that's true. The previous government in Taiwan was also committed to unification. They agreed that Taiwan was part of China. They disagreed about who was running it. So I think the changes in Taiwan are kind of fundamental. But there's also changes that matter on the mainland, that obviously the economic reforms have happened and made China more powerful. They've turned that into military power. And Xi Jinping himself has stressed the importance of unification as part of his project of the great reunification of the Chinese people. So there's also changes over the last decade or so on the mainland that matter.
Why does China still care so much about Taiwan?
To some degree, this is a historical legacy issue. One part of it is what I mentioned, the China Civil War. But in the broader sweep of history, the Chinese view of this is Taiwan is something that was taken away by Western and Japanese imperialism. China lost control of it in 95 after losing the Sino-Japanese War. Japan ran it as a colony till 1945. Then you had the Civil War. So to some degree, this is seen as territory that's rightfully part of China. It's an accident of history that it was taken away, and part of restoring China to a status as a powerful, strong country is regaining control over this territory that was lost. So there's this historical piece of this, there's a Chinese nationalist piece, and there's also the political piece in terms of the Civil War that's never really concluded.
And were China to one day, potentially soon, move on Taiwan, why would that matter for the West?
Well, why it would matter for the West is one thing, it's likely to precipitate a wider war. The U.S. does not have a security treaty with Taiwan, but our policy has stated that what happens to Taiwan is a matter of great interest and concern for the security of the region. And it's our policy to maintain the capacity to resist reunification by force. So it's still a decision up to the president what the United States does or doesn't do. But it seems pretty likely the United States would get involved. And certainly the China and the Chinese military think we would get involved. So you have the potential for this, something that starts out as a political conflict between the two sides, if China decides to resolve it by force, could turn into a wider war between the US and China and a wider regional war. And that's two superpowers, both of which have nuclear weapons. That would have devastating economic impact. There's a lot of trade that goes on across the strait and between China and the rest of the world. That would probably not continue in a conflict. So it's big consequences politically, economically, and also in terms of what happens with a military conflict.
We'll come back to what any potential military conflict may look like in a moment. It's worth saying, first of all, Philip, just for those who may be not aware, you're not obviously speaking in relation to the US government. You're speaking in a personal capacity. I know you're very keen for us just to make that clear, but we really appreciate your expertise on this. Tell us about the election this weekend then. Who's in the running and what are their various positions?
Okay, there's three candidates for the presidency. Lai Ching-te, who is the current vice president, he is the candidate of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. I think it's fair to say that his party is pro-independence, that they have little interest in any kind of unification with China. They see Taiwan already as an independent sovereign state. And as a consequence, when his predecessor, when Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, got elected, China basically broke off official dialogue with Taiwan and has started a low-grade pressure campaign. So if he wins, you can look for a continuation of that campaign. I would say he's identified as sort of a pro-Taiwan independence candidate who's not really interested in closer ties with the mainland. The second candidate is Hou Yu-ih. He is the Kuomintang, the KMT's candidate. He is currently mayor of New Taipei City. That's Taiwan's biggest city. He has an extensive law enforcement background. He's a policeman, was head of the National Police Agency. And so the KMT holds that Taiwan's part of China, is committed to eventual unification, but no time soon. And only if the conditions are right, for that to be a good thing. So they have endorsed what's called the 1992 Consensus, which is basically a broad commitment that Taiwan's part of China. And on that basis, when they were in power from 2009 to 2016, had a stable dialogue going, had a lot of economic agreements with China, and generally had a pretty stable environment across the Taiwan Strait. So he is running kind of that he'll put that back in place. He'll get along with China. He will make good deals that are good for good for Taiwan, but he's in no hurry to have discussions on unification because that's not where the Taiwan public is. That's not what the Taiwan public wants. The third candidate is Ko Wen-je. He is the former mayor of Taipei. He's a medical doctor. He's the candidate for the Taiwan People's Party, which is a relatively new party. It's sort of set up to be a vehicle for his presidential ambitions. And he's running right now a distant third in the polls. But I think the key dynamic here is that while Lai Ching-te is ahead in the polls by 3 to 6%, depending on who you want, there's more people who favor the opposition party candidates than who favor him. And so that's a really big question for the elections going forward is can he turn out all his support? Can he draw support from the independents and the non-party people in Taiwan, which is a very big percentage? Or will the opposition split the vote and allow him to win with a plurality? So that's, I think, the big dynamic we're looking for in the election.
And sometimes you hear this election described as being a contest between pro-China politicians and people who value Taiwanese independence. Is that oversimplifying it? Is it almost more of a debate about how best to approach China, whether you define yourself by really declaring your independence and that's the best way to protect your sovereignty, or whether you try and accommodate China more and win them over that way?
Sure. Well, it's a democratic society, and where the people are is they like the status quo. They regard declaring independence as too risky. That might precipitate a war with China. Nobody wants that. On the other hand, they look at a China that is increasingly authoritarian, and there's not much support for the mainland's approach of one country, two systems. They saw how that worked out in Taiwan. Nobody's really attracted to that. So there's not much desire to get closer to China politically or to have any kind of political talks about unification. So the position, the mainstream position, is let's keep the status quo, and let's try to stabilize that. And the two candidates, all three candidates, are sort of trying to appeal to that center. And I think they have to make different cases. Lai Ching-te has to make the case to the Taiwan public, I can manage this relationship. I'm not going to do anything crazy. I'm not going to declare independence. I can preserve the status quo. Ho Yui is making a somewhat different case. He's got to persuade the public, I'm tough enough to stand up to China. I'm not going to make concessions. I'm going to maintain our military. I'm going to take a firm line in negotiations. But I'm going to be able to talk to China. I'm going to be able to stabilize the situation. I'll be able to extract economic benefits for them that are good for Taiwan's economy. And I can manage the cross-strait relations better than the competition. Ko Wen-je has been somewhere in the middle. He has sort of had a very ambiguous policy. He says China and Taiwan are part of the same family. But what does that mean in practice when you try to translate it into policies? I think he's been a little bit vague on that. But I think he's trying to appeal to that same middle ground in Taiwan that wants to keep the status quo and that regards major change in any direction as too risky.
You referenced a moment ago what's been happening in Hong Kong in recent years. To what extent does that feed into the debate in Taiwan?
I think very significantly. I mean, the big thing going on is that if you looked at China a decade ago or 15 years ago, you saw a country that was becoming more open, that was liberalizing its economy, where there was more freedom of expression, and sort of seemed to be moving in the right direction. Under Xi Jinping, that's all moved backwards. It's a country that's more closed off. The economy is increasingly statist. There's not much space at all for opposition or expression of dissident views. And so it's that macro change in China that really mattered. How that played out in Taiwan is China worried about possible independence sentiment in Hong Kong. It worried about opposition, and so it tried to crack down, and it used the vehicle of the national security law to do that. But in the process, it really took away a lot of Hong Kong's democracy, which wasn't perfect, but it was somewhat representative. And Beijing cracked down on that. They cracked down on protesters. They are trying people who protested in criminal courts, and they've made plain that Hong Kong is going to be run by people who are loyal to Beijing, and they're not going to allow any change from that. So the promise of a high degree of autonomy, people in Hong Kong look at and say, well, this is not really what a high degree of autonomy is if Beijing's going to weigh in and pick our leaders. And people in Taiwan who think about the possibility of unification, well, that's what China has promised, a high degree of autonomy. They look at what happens in Hong Kong and they said that's a promise that they really didn't keep. If they didn't keep it with Hong Kong, why should we think they're going to keep it with us?
To put it bluntly, who does China want to win?
China has decided that the DPP and Lai Ching-te in particular are pro-independence candidates. Even if they say they are restrained, even if they are say they are moderates, China doesn't believe it. And particularly because Lai in speeches has called himself a worker for Taiwan independence. And the Chinese sort of say he said flat out what he is. He's going to work for that, and that really diminishes any hope for unification. So they definitely, I think, support Hou Yu. They support the KMT. They view that as a party that they can work with. I don't think they're under illusions that the KMT wants to pursue unification anytime soon. But they think that will stabilize the situation, and it'll give them a chance to try to make the case to Taiwan people that unification would be a good thing. The PRC policy is to pursue peaceful unification. They say that's what their preference is, and I think that's true. But they haven't ruled out the use of force. So they're kind of in a middle place here. They're trying not to be so threatening to damage Ho's chances, but also to make the point that the cross-strait relationship would be a lot better if a KMT candidate wins the election.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you how, if at all, and I'm sure it's more of a how as opposed to if, China have been trying to influence this election. Is it purely in rhetoric?
No, it's not purely in rhetoric. There's what they say, and they've kind of expressed a very clear preference for who they think would be the better choice in this election, and what some of the consequences would be if the Taiwan voters pick a DPP candidate. I think they have made some covert efforts to influence that. So they are active on the internet. They're active with disinformation. They're using their controlled media to try to get this message out. But I think more to the point is they've also used military pressure and implicit threats. So this is one of the things since August of last year when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan. The PRC and the PLA have really ramped up the military pressure around the island. They're doing a lot more maneuvers around the island. They're crossing the center line. They're doing exercises close to Taiwan. And they're trying to make the point that they have the military capacity to exert this kind of pressure and to damage Taiwan quite badly if they have to. So there's a military component to this as well. But as I said, if that military component is too overt, if the pressure is too high, there's a chance it will backfire. So they're trying to calibrate that just right to make the point that if you reelect a DPP candidate, there's more of this to come. And conversely, if you elect a KMT candidate, the situation will stabilize and calm down. And so that's a delicate balance for them to figure out how to walk.
And how likely do you think it is, Philip, that were the DPP to win and potentially win big in the elections this weekend, that China then would take that as the cue to move on Taiwan?
I think they would do something to show their dissatisfaction. But in our book that you mentioned, Crossing the Strait, we took a very detailed look at the military capabilities and the military options China has. And they've made a lot of progress in their military modernization. They've built a very impressive military. But I think, in my personal judgment, they are not there yet in terms of the ability to successfully invade Taiwan. I think they're probably 4 or 5 years away. Some of the problems is that they have is they don't have enough airlift and sea lift, because you've got to get the forces across that 100 nautical miles. And more to the point, once you get them there, you have to keep supplying them with food and munitions. And so they don't quite have that capability yet. They haven't done some of the doctrine pieces. The PLA, the Chinese military, wants to fight a joint warfare where all the services work together, but they've been working out, what does that mean? What is their joint doctrine? What's their joint organization? They've made a lot of progress with that, but they're now at the point of having to rewrite the war plans. How is this going to work in detail? How is the Army going to work with the Air Force, going to work with the Navy in really synergistic ways where everybody knows what to do? And then once you know what you want to do, you then have to train together to figure out how to execute that. And we haven't seen some of the training that we think would really be necessary if they're going to carry out the war plan. So if you're thinking about an invasion, I think they're still several years away from having the military capability to do that. They have other options. The kind of low-level pressure that they've been doing, staying below the threshold of lethal force, they can do that, but that's not a decisive action. They could escalate to what they call a fire strike campaign, so doing airstrikes, doing missile strikes against the island. Uh, Taiwan couldn't defend against that. It would do a lot of damage. But the history of bombing campaigns is they don't generally force countries to surrender. They generally lead to a rally round the flag effect. So it intensifies the opposition. It makes them more determined to resist. And so certainly China could do a lot of damage to Taiwan, but it's not clear that gets to the political result. And then the other option is to do some kind of a blockade where they try to cut off seaborne traffic, airborne traffic, and information flow into Taiwan. That would also be a pretty violent campaign. And the problem with that is the effects take place over time. So you stop the flow of things, and Taiwan is living off its stockpiles and its reserves. And every week it gets a little harder to do that. But it takes a number of weeks for that really to reach a pain point, and it takes more time to really reach a point where it's unbearable pain. And the problem is that allows time for international pressure to mobilize. If the United States decides to intervene, it has time to mobilize its forces and get them to the theater. So it's something that definitely can apply pressure, but it's not likely to be decisive, and it gives the U.S. time to intervene. And then what do you have? Maybe now you have a wider war across the strait, and that's one that's going to cause a lot of damage to China, damage to the PLA, and a lot of economic consequences for everybody.
On this series, Frontline, we spend most of our time discussing the war in Ukraine, and I wonder to what extent China will have been looking on at what's been happening in Ukraine and taking notes and maybe learning lessons.
Absolutely. They study this really, really carefully. They study all foreign conflicts and current foreign militaries closely. So they are looking at it and trying to derive lessons. So what lessons have they learned? I mean, one of the things is that the Russian military was a lot less good than they thought it was. And I think we've all kind of learned that lesson. But some of the specific things are that the morale was a lot poorer, the logistics system was a lot poorer, and their ability really to execute their operations was not as good as everybody thought. So these are certainly things that the PLA is thinking about. On the other hand, they look at this and they say, well, we have a political work system that really inculcates our conscripts with the right attitude. So we think our morale is better and we have ways to keep it going. We've just revised and revamped and reorganized our logistics system. So we've sort of, yes, that was a problem for the Russians, but maybe they've already fixed this problem. I think one thing they will take away is the need to practice the operations that you want to conduct. Because I think once the Russians got stalled, they never really regained the momentum in the campaign. And so if you balance between secrecy and surprise as good things for an attacker with the need to practice and be ready to execute what your plan is, I think they might redraw that balance that, we've got to be sure we can do what we plan to do, even if it gives the United States, even if it gives Taiwan a better picture. I think two other big lessons. One of them is I think they underestimated the U.S. ability to build a political coalition against the Russians and to apply very, very painful economic sanctions. So for the Chinese, I think that suggests that the diplomatic and the political costs of trying to resolve the Taiwan issue with force will be very high, in addition to the military costs and risks. And then I think the other thing is political leadership in Ukraine. The way President Zelensky has been able to get the word out, the way he's been able to hold Ukraine together, attract international support, and get his message out, I think is very critical to the role that to Ukraine's ability to survive and attract international support. And so for Taiwan, the lesson is we've got to, if there is a war, we have to find a way to get our message out and preserve the government. And for China, the lesson is we've got to take out the Taiwan leadership and not let them get their message out. So I think those are some of the lessons from the Ukraine conflict. And again, some of them for China, some of them for Taiwan, what to do, what not to do.
And if China were to move on Taiwan, let's say in 2024, although I hear what you're saying that you think it's more likely in the years to come, what would be the likely response from the West, particularly given the West is already supporting Ukraine's war effort, there's now conflict in the Middle East, and given any economic sanctions would have a massive impact on the West, given how interconnected our economies are now with China?
Sure. Well, some of that's baked into the cards, because if there's a conflict over Taiwan, you're going to see seaborne exports from China stop, basically seaborne exports from Taiwan basically stop. That's a war zone. Ships are not going to sail into Chinese ports. They're not going to sail to Taiwan. So there's a huge economic impact regardless of sanctions. I think you would likely see condemnation of a Chinese attack. I think you would likely see sanctions, certainly against the individuals in China who decided to use force and those who are involved in prosecuting it. So the senior officials of the Chinese Communist Party, the senior officials of the Chinese military. I think you would probably see sanctions targeted at war materials and energy supplies. And I think it would probably be possible to build a pretty robust coalition behind that and sustain that over time. Whether that applies to all trade from China, I think that's a lot harder thing to do. As you say, China is a major trading partner of all the countries in Asia, of European countries, of the U.S. So there's definitely a lot of pain that comes with a conflict, and sanctions would intensify that pain. But it certainly won't be business as usual. It'll be huge economic disruption. And I guess that gets us to the question, what's Xi Jinping's calculus? In my view, if Taiwan declared independence, he would feel he had no alternative but to fight. But I don't think they're going to do that, no matter who wins the election on Saturday. So really, it's a question. And so it would be a war of choice, that it would be a Xi Jinping's decision that they can't wait any longer to resolve this. And that seems to me it's pretty much a rational calculation. What are the what's the gains if I pull this off? What are the costs and risks? And that's militarily. To do an amphibious invasion, that's about the hardest military operation that you can do. And there's a good chance something goes wrong and it might not work. You certainly are going to have economic costs during the conflict. You're probably going to have major economic costs in terms of sanctions. And there will be diplomatic and political costs in China's relations with everybody else in Asia and with the West. That's a lot of costs. That's a lot of reason not to roll the dice on an invasion of Taiwan. So that, I guess for that reason, I'm relatively sanguine for at least the next couple of years. If we look out to 2027, 2028, now you're at a point where the PLA might be reasonably confident we can do this. And then what is the restraining factor? It's those economic and diplomatic aspects of Xi Jinping's calculus. And we don't know exactly how he weights those. We think they're probably pretty important, but we don't know exactly how he weights them.
Just finally, Philip, you do hear sometimes some quite apocalyptic warnings that a conflict between China and Taiwan in which the West was involved could be the trigger for a full-blown World War III. Do you buy those warnings?
I don't buy them in the terms of a full-blown World War III. If by that what we mean is that Russia would come into the conflict, North Korea would come into the conflict, Iran would come into the conflict. China has strategic relations with all of those countries, but China's not willing to take major risks or costs or bear costs on behalf of any of them. And I think they're all self-interested actors who wouldn't bear costs and risks for China. So I don't think it will spread in that way. What I worry about is will it escalate in terms of the level of violence? Because you have two very capable militaries, assuming the U.S. gets involved. They are equipped with weapons all the way up the spectrum to include nuclear weapons. And I think the problem would be if one side or the other is badly losing and they decide they can't bear to lose, that the political costs are too high, do they risk escalating the conflict to a higher level of violence or even to threatening to use or actually using nuclear weapons? I think that's the nightmare scenario that I really worry about, much so than a broad global conflict.
Well, we will all be watching Taiwan very closely this weekend. Dr. Philip Saunders, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, it's my pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.